Robert Lavasseur is a senior consultant and principal at McDowall Associates in Toronto. He spoke with us about compensation committees. What is the role of a compensation committee and why is it important?
Yeah, well, the compensation committee represents the shareholders in matters of executive compensation. Their main goal is to ensure market competitiveness and whether executives are paid for performance. And you know, it's important because although management is managing executive compensation at all times, it really is unfair to ask them to govern their own compensation. So it's critical for an organization to actually have someone overseeing executive compensation from a governance perspective.
What are some of the challenges associated with compensation committees?
Well, at this time, there's one major challenge that compensation committees face. As you probably know, shareholders are pretty grumpy right now about executive compensation. The value of their equity has gone down considerably, and in many cases, they're sort of wondering whether there's a corresponding decrease in the compensation of executives, and it just doesn't seem to be happening to their satisfaction. By the same token, the press is fueling this issue, and you've got institutional shareholders as well as regulatory bodies and governments that are getting involved in executive compensation. And because of that, executive compensation is now very much under the spotlight and from various constituents. And this is something that is new for compensation committees and really very difficult for them to grapple with because they used to have a much lower profile in the past.
What can HR managers do to have a successful relationship with compensation committees?
Well, I think they can do two things, and if they do those well, they're probably going to be ahead of the game. The first one is to provide the committee with a lot of analytics. There's a lot of issues as to how executive compensation is linked to performance and whether certain performance levels will determine various payouts. And as a result, oftentimes there's a bit of a disconnect there, and boards are more and more curious to actually see how the plans that they are overseeing operate under various circumstances, because there are multiple elements that come at play. And I think the second thing that that management can do to help out the committee is to be very, very attentive of the new disclosure requirements. Disclosure requirements are changing and they're evolving and are becoming much more complex. And the advice I give my clients is to start early and to work with your board of directors to ensure that there's a lot of time to edit and back and forth until you achieve a satisfactory result. And I think if you do those two things, you're certainly going to get a head start with your committee.
What are some common mistakes when dealing with compensation committees that HR managers should try to avoid?
Well, I think that the major mistake that managers make with compensation committees, especially the chair of the compensation committee, is lack of communication. The vice president of HR, the CFO, or the head of compensation should really be speaking to the chair of the compensation committee quite regularly, and that doesn't always happen. And I think a lot of that is a legacy issue because, of course, formerly the only person who would speak to members of the board of directors was the chief executive officer, and today we're living in another world where governance is, especially in executive compensation and on the audit side, is really under the microscope. And I think that one of the major mistakes that management does is to not initiate that communication rather. And if you can initiate that communication, there will be a lot fewer surprises, and you're not dealing with as many crises at the board level.